Perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you to Manuel and the organisers for accepting my paper in the first instance, and thank you to Penelope for chairing this panel. Well, I'll get started. The research I'm going to present today is part of my PhD project into contemporary literature by women of African descent in Spanish and Portuguese. It is based on a chapter which explores a theme of urban nightlife across 4 post-colonial cities. So I look at Luanda, the capital of Angola, Malabo, the capital of Equatorial Guinea, Lisbon, and Madrid. In exploring nightlife, I'm primarily interested in 2 main aspects. Firstly, how writers portray the encounters between their chosen protagonists and other partygoers, and secondly, how they describe the setting or backdrop to these interactions, such as a particular bar or club. So nightlife as a theme in culture, and particularly literature, is an area which warrants more attention. In the last decade, there has been an increasing number of publications by Afro-descendant and African writers in Spanish and Portuguese. Nightlife is a prevalent theme that can be traced across a number of these works, both fictional and non-fictional. My paper today will focus on the representation of African clubs in Lisbon and Madrid as portrayed in 2 fictional works. So firstly, we have Temo Travão's Preto Muito Português, which roughly translates to in English as a very Portuguese black man. And then secondly, Osirima Motorapeo's El Ponto Ciego de Cassandra, which roughly translates as Cassandra's blind spot. So from here on in, the paper will be structured as follows. I will start with an overview of my theoretical framework. I will then consider the depiction of African nightclubs in each text individually, before finally drawing some conclusions. Also, just as a caveat, before I move on, I don't really tease out the particularities of both contexts as much as I would like, just due to time, so please feel free to ask me any questions at the end if they're unclear. Okay, so as a lens to reading the portrayals of nightlife in contemporary fiction, I construct a theoretical framework combining 2 sociological concepts. So that's Ruben Burford-May's integrated segregation and Paul Gilroy's conviviality. Ruben Burford-May employs the oxymoron integrated segregation to describe how in urban nightlife, partygoers share a physical space, yet experience segregation as a result of social differences. Whereas Paul Gilroy employs the term conviviality to describe the, and I quote here, processes of cohabitation and interaction that have made multiculture an ordinary feature of social life in post-colonial cities, end quote. However, he adds a caveat that this does not mean what he refers to as the absence of racism or triumph of tolerance. Hence, theoretically, conviviality can be understood as a double-edged sword, not only defined by living together in harmony, but also by moments of tension as a result of social differences. I argue that May's integrated segregation, specific to semi-public night spaces, is akin to the dichotomy of harmony and tension that comprises Gilroy's broader discussion of social life in post-colonial cities through conviviality. The application of such a framework to the respective texts discussed here today unveil how certain non-mainstream night spaces, in this case African nightclubs, can dispel racial stereotypes, temporally subvert power relations, but also through their very existence serve to reinforce tensions and inequalities present in everyday social life. So the first novel that I'm going to explore is Temo Travão's Preto Muito Português, which was published in 2017. Female rapper turned writer Travão was born in Luanda, Angola in 1980 and moved along with her family to Puig, a peripheral Lisbon neighbourhood, in her early teens. Her novel recounts the fictional story of protagonist narrator Brujorda, a Lisboeta, or Lisboner, who is a Cape Verdean descendant of humble origins, the son of a locksmith and a cleaner. He presents a first-person account of growing up in Lisbon's peripheral neighbourhood of Cassim, family life, friendship, failed romances, and struggling to get a job, despite a university education, are some of the themes he touches on besides nightlife. The trope of nightlife is a thread that runs through the novel. As a young adult, Brujorda navigates Lisbon's night spaces between the mid and late noughties, and he appears to have unfettered access to both main street clubs and the ethnically labelled discotecas africanas, or African clubs, that are dotted around Lisbon's metropolitan area. The extracts I discuss are from a chapter in the novel entitled Achas que sabes dançar bujoda, so you think you can dance bujoda in English. They explore a rather fruitful encounter that bujoda has on the pista or dance floor of a Lisbon discoteca africana. The chapter in question commences with bujoda expressing his ambivalence towards African clubs due to the racialized stereotypes regarding dancing. He states that, and I'll quote from the English, it's my own translation of the original text, just so it can be a bit rough at times. Going to African clubs is always a problem for me, firstly because I don't know how to dance. I don't know how to dance at all. I'm a statue frozen in the middle of the dance floor. In this quote, being able to dance is positioned as inseparable to the space of the discoteca africana. On the contrary, Tavon employs a range of literary techniques to emphasize bujoda's inability to dance. For instance, the repetitive use of plosive alliteration on the consonant P, which you can see highlighted there in the Portuguese original version of the text. The plosive alliteration draws our attention to the space of the pista, or dance floor, placing it as center stage in this particular club. It is also symbolic of the abruptness with which bujoda's paralysis in the dance floor clashes with the smooth flow of other partygoers around him. Tavon's overt emphasis on bujoda's lack of dancing expertise is to overcompensate and counteract the deep-seated stereotype among bujoda's white friends. They believe that all blacks know how to dance well and whites can't. However, through an encounter on a dance floor in a particular Lisbon discoteca africana, bujoda comes to realize that he has also been socially conditioned to believe that whites can't dance. On this particular occasion, he is no longer frozen still, but is taught how to dance the Angolan partner dances of Kizomba and Tarashina by two white people. One his friend, Joaquim, and the other a stranger who he describes as a white girl with a trupera attitude. Trupera is a colloquial slang phrase referring to someone from the city of Porto. The counter therefore demonstrates that in the act of dancing together, social differences such as one's regional origins are absolved. Moreover, the unnamed white female approaches Joaquim with such directness and self-assuredness that her actions subvert the traditional heteronormative and patriarchal dynamics of a night out in which male partygoers pursue females. So just moving on now to the second novel, El Punto Ciego de Cassandra, by Osirima Motoripio, also published in 2017. Rupio was born in Madrid in 1989 and is of Ecuador Ghanaian descent. She is an occupational therapist by training. However, marked by the events of her adolescence growing up in the outskirts of Madrid, she began to write about them at the age of 16. Her coming-of-age novel recounts the story of protagonist narrator Cassandra, a Gaditana, so that's a person from the city of Cadiz, and she's also the daughter of a Cape Verdean mother and Ecuador Ghanaian father. The novel follows a year in the school life of Cassandra, recounting the trials and tribulations of Cassandra and her school friends, dealing with themes such as the loss of virginity, breakups, and teenage pregnancy. Regarding nightlife, at home in Cadiz, Cassandra and her close circle of friends partake in typical adolescent pursuits such as a botellón, which refers to the gathering of young people who come together to drink in outdoor spaces. They also attend a New Year's Eve party to welcome the year 2009 at a friend's house. However, to mark the end of exams, Cassandra and her friends go on a girls' trip to Madrid. At this point in the novel, most of them are now of age and they head on two separate nights out. Firstly, to a city centre club named Chiara, and secondly, an African club 69 in the municipality of Móstoles. While in Madrid, the girls stay with Laura, Cassandra's older cousin, in Alcorcón, which is another municipality next to Móstoles. So just for a brief aside here, both Móstoles and Alcorcón form part of the south zone of the Madrid community region and are areas where small pockets of immigrants from Spain's former colony of Equatorial Guinea have settled. In fact, in Lucía Mbombe's 2019 novel, Hica del Camino, Móstoles is described as an extension of Alcorcón and said to be known for its African clubs. So all this is to say is that the geographical setting of Móstoles is a significant one. During the girls' short break in Madrid, Laura, Cassandra's cousin, not only acts as their host, but she is also attributed the role of resident tour guide. She takes them on a journey of both the city centre landmarks and also the existing nightlife scenes on offer across the city. I will now turn my attention to Rapeo's description of the nightclub setting, and particularly the discoteca africana 69. Rapeo persistently places the nightclub settings of Guisado and 69 into juxtapositioning. Firstly, each chapter of the novel is divided into subheaded sections. The section on Guisado and 69 have mimicking titles, which roughly translate into English as Night Out in Guisado, Night Out in 69. Moreover, through Cassandra's internal monologue, both establishments are also repeatedly brought into comparison from the moment she sets foot in the second club 69. In the first example here, music is noted as the only similarity between the two clubs. However, there is a stark difference in how the soundtracks of each club are presented to the reader by the narrator. In the first club, Guisado, Cassandra notes the specific songs and artists playing, such as Busta Rhymes and Mariah Carey's R&B hit, I Know What You Want. In the African club, which is the quote seen on screen, she resorts to generic categories such as African music, then citing only one genre, which is funk music, before grouping other African styles into the category of the rest. Through Cassandra's disregard for 69's soundtrack, Rapeo demonstrates the problematics of the label African when employed generically to refer to heterogeneous groups of people or music styles. So the comparison between the two clubs goes beyond that of music and also includes setting. The description of setting, and particularly 69's dance floor, which is represented as extremely small, is notable. Guisado, on the other hand, is presented as a vast space with giant TV screens and VIP areas. The result of these distinctions is to allude to the economic inequalities between leisure spaces in the city centre and in specific neighbourhoods that are inhabited by immigrants and their descendants. So the final element I want to discuss is Laura's role of resident tour guide, which is also maintained within the confinements of the African nightclub. On entering 69, Laura is warmly welcomed by everyone and introduces Cassandra and company to the club's various DJs. She is the role assigned to Laura in this setting hints at the potential exclusiveness of the club, an exclusiveness not defined by discriminatory door entry practice based on race, but who you know. For instance, one of the DJs the girls are introduced to is Mini, a buen amigo or good friend of Laura's. The most striking observation that Cassandra and her twin friends make about Mini is that for a little white guy, or Blanquito, he is a good DJ. Therefore, the incident also serves to dispel racial stereotypes such as that DJing well is a quality specific to one race or another. Moreover, the employment of the diminutive ito in addressing Mini as Blanquito on one level can be seen as an affectionate and informative address, given the friendly atmosphere of the club. On the other, it can also be seen as the subtle subversion of the patriarchal white male gaze, given that the events relayed to us are from the perspective of a young and confident Black female narrator. And so just to conclude, on the one hand, the literary depictions of African nightclubs in the work of Chabon and Rapeo demonstrate how certain night spaces and the types of convivialities or social interactions that they foster contribute to both the dispelling of racial stereotypes and the destabilization of the patriarchal and heteronormative behaviours that govern nightlife. Whilst these depictions set in the late noughties show that the clientele of African clubs remains predominantly African or of African descent, they also demonstrate that African clubs are racially mixed spaces and not exclusively for African or Afro-descendant partygoers. Therefore, applying Buford May's concept of integrated segregation to African clubs in the peripheries of Lisbon and Madrid proves problematic, as partygoers mix across racial lines in a shared physical space. On the other hand, if we change the perspective from what goes on within African clubs to the place of African clubs within wider urban nightlife, a slightly different image emerges. This is particularly evident when Rapio juxtaposes the mainstream club Guisado with African Club 69. One of the reasons that African clubs emerged in the first place in these contexts was due to the racist entry practices in mainstream clubs. Africans and Afro-descendants continue to be subjected to such discriminatory practices in the present. Therefore, in the grand scheme of things, the literary texts also document how nightlife contributes to the racial inequalities and social tensions present within the wider social life. And that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin, for this stimulating presentation. Without any transition, I'm going to open the floor for Kevin Milburn, who's from London South Bank University, and will present a paper entitled In the Wee Small Hours. I'm not going to sing it, but everyone's got it in mind. Frank Sinatra and the gendered performativity of solitude in the nocturnal city.
Okay, can you guys see the my slides okay there? Okay, just go to, thanks very much, Penelope. Great, so thanks and hello everybody, welcome from London, which is nice sunny mornings. It feels slightly odd to be talking about nighttime sort of matters on for once the sun is shining. As you may have deduced from the title of this presentation, music, the city and darkness is central to my work. I work in the human geography department. We also do quite a lot of activity and teaching in the sort of planning courses and also the events and entertainment courses as well. But sort of geography is my training effectively. In terms of my background, when I tell people that I'm a music geographer, eyebrows are invariably raised. Music geographer still isn't the most common portmanteau in the English language, despite the fact that, as this slide illustrates, there's been an active engagement between geography and music for many years. I don't actually have time here to go into all these different approaches, but hopefully this highlights the scope of engagement that's taken place. However, none of these geographical studies on the screen here, the exception to some extent of Aaron Saldana's work about dancing in sort of Goa nightclubs and beaches, has given much consideration to matters of the night in connection to music. My talk today is linked to my PhD research that was completed some while ago now, it must be said, but which I've recently and belatedly begun to re-engage with. That research was originally propelled by my desire to critically examine the role that pop musicians have played in representing and embodying the urban. In particular, I wanted to look at the work of balladeers, and more specifically still, that of Frank Sinatra, particularly in the 1950s, and the cult Glaswegian ambient pop band, the Blue Nile, in the 1980s, to interrogate what I perceived as an overt, aestheticized perception of the urban imaginary in their work. So what interested me was not just how particular cities are represented, but also how certain artists engage with the idea of cities. And to some extent here, I think that kind of relates to what Erin was just talking about in those numbers. I wanted to tease out how their responses to experiences and emotions encountered in and generated by cities are informed by environmental, structural, and individual factors. These factors include gender, technology, issues of mobility, and of most relevance here, time, and specifically the nighttime. Today, with the exception of a couple of references to Blue Nile, I'll be focusing on Frank Sinatra, and in particular, his relationship to night and to darkness. I will examine how Sinatra invoked what the musicologist Adam Crims identified as, I quote, an urban ethos, end quote. I will reflect on how Sinatra drew on the night and on darkness to represent urban spaces, especially in the 1950s, and how in the 1960s, especially, he then became synonymous with one town that is particularly associated with darkness in different registers, namely Las Vegas. In Frank Sinatra's critical heyday, in my view, and in the view of many music critics, namely the late 1950s, Much of the material that he recorded was a brooding city soundtrack with a distinct after-hours aesthetic. It evoked and beautified solitude in urban settings, and so was comparable to work being carried out in the visual arts by Edward Hopper and others, and much later, in an oral sense, by the Scottish band, the Blue Nile. Commenting on the debut LP by that Glaswegian group, who I just mentioned, who were explicit in their admiration for Sinatra, and whose fans also drew parallels with Edward Hopper's work, the music writer Brian Hogg stated the following: "The picturesque urban soundscapes on offer from the Blue Nile were both delightful and haunting. The notion of space, of being the outsider," and again here I think that perhaps relates to what Erin was just talking about, "was enhanced by arrangements scrupulously open-ended. Singer Paul Buchanan's wearied 2 a.m. tone proved ideal for the collective sense of alienation." We can think here perhaps about the role of formats and technology in conveying this particular sense of alienation and indeed of the night. Like the Blue Nile with CDs in the 1980s, the arrival of the 12-inch vinyl album, largely pioneered by Frank Sinatra and his label Capitol in the 1950s, was a showcase for modernity. Its sound, its thematic content, and the visual accompaniment were promoted as a shorthand for sophistication. It was tapping into a new kind of audience. They were a key component also in articulating an after-hours lifestyle chic. Also influential in the evocation of this nighttime cool was the jazz label Blue Note. The look of their iconic 1950s sleeves had a lasting legacy, as shown by the cover to the Blue Nile's 1984 album Hats, a design that also doffs its trilby the influence of historic man-in-the-shadow archetypes such as the flaneur and the private detective in film noir. But prior to Blue Note and albums on Blue Note, such as John Coltrane's Blue Train, released in 1958, we see elements of this kind of idea being manifest in the artwork to Sinatra's 1954 album, Songs for Young Lovers. And that's because I contend that Sinatra's music was, in part, a musical commentary on urban environments and, in particular, on urban environments encountered at night. Unsurprisingly, Sinatra's urban fantasies found expression on the cover art that accompanied his records throughout his career, as we see here. What particularly drew me to Sinatra as a subject for research is that in his work, the city is presented as a signifier for a rather maudlin, male-authored form of solipsism and alienation on the one hand, and for sophistication, cosmopolitan glamour, and a confident swagger on the other hand. I'll focus today on the former outlook, in other words, on the more downbeat material, much of it recorded with the considerable assistance of arrangers Nelson Riddle and Gordon Jenkins. On Sinatra's 80th birthday in 1995, a date that saw the Empire State Building bathed in blue for old Blue Eyes, a fellow Jersey boy, Bruce Springsteen, serenaded the singer at a gala performance in Los Angeles. Springsteen performed Angel Eyes, an affecting torch song that Sinatra recorded for his 1958 album, Only the Lonely. Before doing so, Springsteen reflected on the impact that Sinatra, who was sat in the audience, had exerted on him. Bruce said the following, and I quote, "My first recollection of Frank's voice was coming out of a jukebox in a dark bar on a Sunday afternoon. It was a voice filled with bad attitude, life, beauty, excitement, freedom, sex, and a sad knowledge of the ways of the world. Every song seemed to have as its postscript, and if you don't like it, here's a punch in the kisser. But it was the deep bluesness of Frank's voice that affected me the most. And while his music became synonymous with black tie, good life, the best booze, sophistication, his blues voice was always the sound of hard luck and men late at night with the last $10 in their pockets trying to figure a way out." End quote. Another song from the Only the Lonely album, One for My Baby, brackets, One More for the Road, which is a signature saloon bar song of Frank Sinatra's from that period, is also emblematic of this nighttime persona that he cultivated and which Springsteen alludes to there. And that same persona is also front and center of Sinatra's 55 album, In the Wee Small Hours, which we see on the top left here. This LP is now considered a classic and was arguably the first concept album, the concept being misery, with Sinatra, the ruminative anti-hero, shuffling gloomily from one dimly lit lamppost to another, but it was a disc originally accepted with reluctance by Capitol Records, who felt that a work so relentlessly dark might be perceived as oppressive and alienating. In George Simmels' The Metropolis and Mental Life essay, he expounded upon an idea of the city as being both a site of freedom and of isolation. A dialectical view of urban living was thus presented, namely the sense of liberation that metropolitan life is often seen as enabling is a freedom that is also implicated in a resultant sense of drift and ennui. Likewise, Secret Krakau's work on subject formation also offered insights into alienation, boredom, and loneliness in the city. And I think Sinatra's work here is touching on a lot of this. Besides Springsteen, another artist who cites Sinatra as a symbol for big city dreams turned sour, but also for nocturnal loneliness, is Rickie Lee Jones. On the title track of her second album, Pirates, Jones pays homage to Sinatra's role as the patron saint for deluded dreamers, those who aspire to be the cocksure Frank, but are more likely to end up resembling instead the downhill narrator encountered in Sinatra's aforementioned One for My Baby, One More for the Road. In Jones' song, Pirates, she acknowledges the allure of the city and recognises the attraction of it as a mythical location in which to make it, a veiled reference to Sinatra's most famous line, "If I can make it there, I'll make it anywhere," from New York, New York. But her delivery suggests that in all probability, the sad-eyed Sinatras of whom she sings are heading to and not from Lonely Avenue. Accompanying this sense of solitude is a palpable sense of drift and entrapment. Their Nighthawk characters, found in much of Sinatra's 50s material, shuffled endlessly around familiar street furniture, from lamppost to statue, from street corner to bar. Moving in a stop-start fashion, they appeared unwilling, or perhaps unable, to extricate themselves from the dark labyrinth of the city in which they found themselves. The Sinatra scholar, T.H. Adamowski, contends that in Sinatra's late 50s work, the singer projects a distinct pop existentialist persona, one that can be seen as being entirely in keeping with what the sociologist Keith Tester contends were, and I quote, existentialist attempts to discover the secrets of being in the modern, brackets, namely urban, metropolitan, and public world, which were kind of felt more widely within society in the late 1950s and also explored by other artists such as Miles Davis, but also in literature such as Sartre and others. As well as being identified with a general urban sensibility, Sinatra is also associated with specific locations. These include his birthplace, Hoboken in New Jersey, also New York, Chicago, Hollywood, Palm Springs, which is shown here with his rather fantastic house that he had there, and of course, Las Vegas. In the early 1950s, Sinatra, due to declining interest in him at the time as a recording artist, began to accept more jobs being made to him by gangsters such as Skinny DeMarte. Consequently, he appeared with greater frequency at casino locations such as Atlantic City in his native New Jersey, but also a town in the Nevada desert that was rapidly developing by taking advantage of the state's lax gambling restrictions, namely Las Vegas. Sinatra's nocturnal association with that town initially came about via his first appearance in a feature film with Tommy Dorsey's band in a film called Las Vegas Nights, made in 1941. However, it wasn't until September 1951 that he undertook his first major solo engagement in the town. And soon after, from 1953 onwards, Sinatra's involvement with the town increased via his connection with the Sands Hotel and nightclub and casino. He owned a 9% stake in the venture and went on to become the vice president of the corporation that ran it. It's said the singer earned $100,000 for each week he performed there, often as part of the so-called Rat Pack of entertainers, which he headed up, and which also included Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. During this period, Sinatra perfected his nightclub style of performance, a style that would later be eclipsed when Las Vegas came to be characterized by much larger venues. The original small nightclub atmosphere was so much to his liking that he even studiously tried to replicate it when recording his albums. His recording sessions always took place at night, often very late, and guests would be invited into the darkened studio in order to help him recreate this live after-hours performance feel. By the late 1950s, Las Vegas was already becoming known as a place of darkness. The darkness of the desert night, but also as a town that came to life at night. But other types of darkness attached themselves too. The darkness of the town's aforementioned mafia rule, with a mob effectively responsible for building and running Vegas. And here we see Sinatra in the bottom left there in a passenger seat with sat next to a leading mob boss, Sam Giancana, directly behind him. And there was also another type of darkness that was associated with Las Vegas, a blindingly bright one. Again, it was connected to its surrounding desertscape, with Vegas located just 65 miles from the Nevada test site, a primary testing location of US nuclear devices from 51 to 92, and a place where an almost unimaginable 928 announced nuclear tests took place. And through all of Las Vegas's growth through several decades, Frank Sinatra remained closely identified with this town of darkness and of light, sometimes blinding light, neon, natural, and nuclear light. His relationship to the place was summarized by the writer Gilbert Gigliotti, and I quote, "It was Sinatra who, as a headliner, acted as a prime mover in old Vegas, when it was an old entertainment mecca, quite different from the sanitized corporate atmosphere of the present day strip," end quote. But it remains, partly thanks to Sinatra, a strip that nonetheless continues to irradiate that corner of Nevada each and every night. So, to conclude, I started this morning by discussing Frank Sinatra's output and examining the ways that a metropolitan nighttime outlook and aesthetic was made explicit in his music. I then moved on to consider Frank Sinatra's close relationship to a leisurescape that is permanently associated with the night, namely Las Vegas, America's quintessential Sin City, a place constituted by the seductive yet troubling interplay of neon hum, late night thrills, and desert darkness. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Kevin, for this interesting paper. Without any more transition, I'm going to open the floor to Jaime Puig Guisado. I'm sorry if I'm not saying this right, but Jaime is from Universidad, Sevilla, and he's going to speak about night technologies in the city through Mexican poetry. Jaime, if you're here, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Penelope. Thank you so much for the organization. I have to share a screen. Okay, can you see well?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Juan José Tablada, in his book Lipo y otros poemas, 1920, collects one of his most analyzed poems, Nocturno Alterno. According to Valdés, Lipo was the most avant-garde poetic form in Mexico, and his Nocturno Alterno becomes the great reference of the work, since it brings with it the modern language of the New York City, although linked to the mystical tradition of the union between the soul and the moon. This idea of the connection between two concepts is recurrent in most of the elements that make up the poem. The technique that Tablada had already been practicing of parallelism in previous compositions between two realities this time is reflected in the idea of parallelism between two spaces. In this case, between the cities of New York and Bogota, presented as opposite scenes, the calm and provincial Bogota in front of the modern New York. On the one hand, the Colombian capital is presented with cold walls, mute houses, and silent tiles, on which the cats rest in a prototypical image of the nocturnal imagery that the face of traditional civilization can offer, an image of the past. On the other hand, the city that never sleeps is portrayed in a golden night, a chromatic tone that intensifies the color of champagne, the brightness of evening dresses, or the symbolism of consumption that nightlife implies, associated with the social world of the rector's restaurant on Broadway. The association of the golden with the light is direct. The fun that dancing brings, foxtrot, and the exploration of the artificial paradise that the New York gown parties involves through alcohol are only possible under the illumination of the urban night. This modern space also appears accelerated in a frenetic rhythm hand with leisure and vices, which in previous periods was banned as a space for sin and the transgression of bourgeois morality. In this new way of life, in which the hustle and bustle and the exaltation of pleasures begin to be the norm at the time of dayfall, New York is proposed as a new hegemonic paradigm in this field, rivaling the cultural and leisure capital at that time, Paris, which had been the nucleus of meeting of artists and intellectuals from all over the world, but also of drinking and festivities. On the other hand, the other golden tone, also of acceleration and modernity, is provided by electric lights. The technological advance that the American city presents compared to the Colombian one is clear from the title, in which alterno refers to electricity and, in extension, to light, creating the dualism between lights and dark, nocturnal, from the beginning. In turn, the typography of the poem follows this line. The verses that we understand to refer to Bogota appear in bold compared to those that refer to New York, intensifying the association of light with the North American capital and that of darkness with the South American capital. Continuing with this analysis of the visual point, of the visual in the poem, we can appreciate how the text forms a curve, you can see here, that reminds us of the profile of the moon from the title itself to the last verse, writing in capital letters, and which reads La Luna, the moon, with small capital letters, compared to the rest of the verses that are writing in the usual way. So we can understand that there is a clear intention to indicate the graphic design, highlighting the word that designates the terrestrial satellite, and that in the poem is the connecting link of the lyrical content, since and yet is one the same in New York and in Bogotá. Y sin embargo es una misma en New York y en Bogotá. The moon, as a typical element of traditional nocturnal imagery, is proposed as the phenomenon that links the two phases of the reality presented, that of the provincial Bogotá and that of modern New York. Thus, there is a confluence of two concepts in a third, just as there is a confluence of two significance or fonts in a third visual form that appears in the void. The white of the page, thanks to the darkness that delimits the letters of the text. We see these ideas of duality constantly at the time. We can think that they come from the emergence of the calligram and other visual explorations in literature, but also from scientific and philosophical approaches that we are developed at the time, such as Bergson's theory of simultaneity, for example. In Mexican estudiantismo, we can also observe this feature and see how the theme of duality and the night within the framework of the technological city is presented in a different way. According to Schneider, estudiantismo is here to Marinetti's futurism and the ultraísmo represented by Guillermo de Torre, Elices, for example, and Rafael Lasso de la Vega. In their manifesto, they speak about cutting off the current and breaking the traffic lights. They also want to send Chopin to the electric chair because of his melancholy nights. They inaugurate a new a new student phase in Mexican literature, like the movement itself, possibly the most radical avant-garde at the poetic level, in addition to the arts sponsored by the Mexican government, and which has strong ties to the painting of Diego Rivera, among others, for its futuristic and nationalistic character. Maples Arce, another stridentista poet, its most representative figure speaks of the close relationship between modernity and urban lighting, since the night scene is transformed and the look at night changes. As the night fills with light, new colors, new ways of life, new jobs, new needs, etc., are discovered. This civilization that firmly believes in progress and is sustained by possession causes a progressive conquest of the night to take place in the same way that empires conquer territory, although in this case over time, according Melvin. One of the components of this group, although normally it has not been fully affiliated with it, and not too much space has been dedicated to it, has been Luis Quintanilla. He is one of the authors that interest us the most for the subject of which we speak by the fact of composing several poetic composition, Nocturnal, within the framework of this modern terminological work. Although he does not stop going many times to certain romantic cliches and melancholic tones. Sometimes they are used with irony, but this is how we see the mixture of perspectives that are shown at this time in terms of urban and nocturnal consideration. If we look at all the reasons for the nocturnal night that Tanilla's nocturnal people offer us, we can think that there is a contradiction as time goes by and about the idea of progress, urban and technological society. Since electric light is presented as healing in the face of turbulent night, but on the other hand, mechanized society brings annoyance that in past time did not exist, such as the noise of engines. Thus, in Tanilla's poetics, we can discover certain misgivings towards modernity, and at the same time that he uses an avant-garde literature that mixes all influences, but that tries to break with previous poetics through a new language. This writing from the uncertainty makes us think that we are in a turbulent stage in which changes are fast, and this is reflected in the stridentista poetics. It is ironic in Chaplin's Modern Times, for example. Alejandro Palma alludes to the fact that these contradictions of modernization could be the result of the time, as well as his creative pseudonym, Quintanilla, which could also respond to the need to distance himself from Luis Quintanilla del Valle, official name, who works for the Mexican government as a diplomat and offers an institutional image that does not go well with the extravagant ideas of his verses. In Tanilla, we can find a clear influence with the poetics of Tablada, which develops in parallel terms since he incorporates the Oriental vocation to his pseudonym and tries similar typographic innovations. Ward argues that when he sings with the monogram KT, Quintanilla, there is an intention of incorporating a visual manifestation to traditional writing. In addition to giving his name a more cosmopolitan character that the time required and which matches his itinerant character. Thus, his avant-garde work is presented by a modern author who declares himself receptive to the trends of the moment to project a poetics located beyond Mexican nationalism. While the modern stages of tablada were located, especially in New York, Quintanilla's preferred the location for some of her nightlife in Paris. Is Paris. Sorry. Although he had also toured the United States, where he married Ruth Stahl-Smith, with who curiously has the wedding trip to Beijing. In this way, Quintanilla has explored the main cities that represent the modernity of the moment, and his stridentista perspective broadens the form that had previously been written about the night. His main works are Avión, Plane, and Radio, titles that demonstrate his passion for technology. In Avión, 1923, we find a series of nocturnals that seem to dialogue with the poem of Rubén Darío, with the paintings of Jane Whistler, but also with the mechanized city. Nocturno Incoloro, Colorless, talks about the horrible technology of World War in the darkness. In the Nocturnal Azul, Blue, the poet complains about the annoyance caused by the noise of the train at night. Modern industrialized society brings new headaches and transforms the night, disturbed sleep and still calm, something that American nature used to do, presented as an aggressor and cause or accomplice of the misfortunes of the poetic speakers. I have some words about Javier Villarrutia, but I think it's better to continue to Octavio Paz to go faster. Finally, Octavio Paz writes Nocturno de San Ildefonso in 1974, an acclaimed poem that combines topics as diverse as Mexican history, political revision, or passionate love in the night world. The allusion that Octavio Paz makes to the modern city in poems such as Entrada en Materia, with its roar of engines, whistling whistles, screeching of brakes, the neon is shelled, the electric light is knives. Paz combines the romantic symbolist tradition with the technological modernity that Estudiantismo and other avant-gardes provide. Thus, electricity, the progress of the neon lights of the advertisements on the street, also bring marginalization and criminality, robberies, deaths, etc. Okay, conclusions. In conclusion, we can observe how all these authors explore a dual dimension of the night. From his poems, we can see the advantages of the progress that humanity has developed in the nocturnal setting, but there is also a criticism, irony, or contemplation of the negative aspects that this modernity brings. Depending on the time, we can observe a more exciting assimilation of technology, as in the case of tablada or estridentismo, that directly make in their new religion, accompanied by the growing faith in science that the society of the moment is developing. These advances also have consequences in the way of relating at night, in leisure, in love. This is how Villarrutia captures it in his nights with homosexual meetings, for example. Octavio Paz also reflects this modern language and reflects on the different technological aspects, always dialoguing with the poetic tradition that presets it. In general terms, we observe how the night becomes a theme of Mexican literature and how an interdependence is established with the notions of modernity and progress that come from the hand of positivism and that change its perception over time. At the end, I have a reflection why nights connects technology and arts. This is all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jaime.